Welcome to the deep dive. You've sent us a really fascinating set of sources this time. We're going to jump right in and look at these arguments about the potential decline of the American empire. We'll be looking at some historical parallels people are drawing, particularly with Germany and the rise of Hitler, and also thinking about what else might be out there, alternative global futures. It's definitely provocative territory, so let's get into it.
Absolutely. And I think it's key, especially when we approach these historical analogies like the Hitler comparison. We have to be clear we're not looking for, a direct one-to-one match. That's not the point. It's more about spotting underlying pressures, societal vulnerabilities, things that might look different today but have similar roots. We want to pull out insights about, economic changes, political polarization, how global power is shifting.
Right. And you, our listener, you specifically asked about those Trump-Hitler comparisons. Now, the sources you sent do stress that a direct equation is, deeply problematic, obviously, given the history. But we do need to explore why people are even making this comparison. What's the thinking there?
Exactly. The core argument isn't really about an equivalence of actions, but maybe about similar conditions in society. Conditions that could potentially allow certain kinds of movements to gain traction. What's interesting in these sources is the idea that just focusing on the leaders themselves, Trump or Hitler, might actually distract us from the bigger picture, the deeper systemic forces at work.
Okay, let's unpack that. Those systemic forces. What were the sources saying about Germany back then?
Well, they really paint a picture of just immense pressure on the German working class before Hitler. You had the economic fallout from World War I, obviously.
Huge devastation.
Huge. Then the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations.
Interesting terms, yeah.
Right. Losing their colonies. And this sort of profound national shock. A loss of standing. It was layer upon layer of crisis.
And the argument then is that we see some echoes of that today in the experience of the American working class.
That's the parallel being drawn, yes.
Right.
Think about the decades of, widening income gaps, wealth inequality, then the shock of the pandemic, inflation hitting people hard. And this maybe perception that America's global standing isn't what it once was. Uncontested leadership seems less certain. Plus, you add in the impact of long wars, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the complexities in Ukraine, it can feed a sense of decline or lost influence.
And this is where the sources get quite specific, linking it to certain actions or rhetoric. They talk about targeting un-American ideology. That Smithsonian example came up. It makes you think historically about things like the House Un-American Activities Committee, McCarthy's.
There's a really crucial link the sources make. Those historical moments serve as warnings.
Oh, right.
About government trying to police thought. And they also pointed to Secretary of State Rubio's comments about potentially expelling foreign students for their political views. Some see that as a move towards, clamping down on dissent.
And beyond just talk, the sources mention the mobilization of certain groups. The Proud Boys were cited as maybe a modern parallel to some of Hitler's early backers. And this perceived erosion of democratic norms, things like universities perhaps bending under pressure regarding protests.
Yes, those are highlighted as potential warning signs, according to these analyses. But there's a key difference pointed out, too, which is interesting. The U.S. today doesn't really have the kind of strong, organized, left, socialist, communist movements that existed in pre-Hitler Germany. And some argue that absence might, paradoxically, make it harder to push back against certain trends.
So the main thrust isn't Trump is Hitler, but more that his presidency, these actions, they're seen as symptoms of a larger decline. Symptoms may be worrying ones, but symptoms nonetheless, not the sole cause. And things like the breakdown of the two-party system, voter apathy, those point to deeper issues too.
Exactly, that's the framing. And Trump's economic moves, like tariffs, are presented less as some grand strategy and more as a kind of desperate measure. A Hail Mary, as one source put it, driven perhaps by a feeling that other options for dealing with economic anxieties or competition weren't working.
Okay, tariffs. Let's dig into that. The sources brought up history here too, like tariffs on foreign cars back in the day, and then you see Volkswagen and Toyota rise anyway. It wasn't straightforward protectionism.
No, it often isn't. And think about the long-term tariffs on foreign pickup trucks. Have they really just protected U.S. industry? Or have they shaped what Americans buy over decades, partly because competitors were priced higher? The sources suggest the impact of tariffs is really complex, often unpredictable, lots of unintended consequences.
So, looking at Trump's proposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada, the potential downsides seem pretty significant based on this analysis. You could see issues with immigration, if their economies suffer, less money sent home by workers, higher prices for us on basics, coffee, lumber, even electricity from Canada.
And this is where China's role becomes so important now. If the U.S. imposes tariffs, countries often have other places to sell, other places to buy from, China being the major one. The U.S. doesn't have the same leverage it used to. The sources even mention Canadians changing travel plans, sort of voting with their wallets in protest.
And domestically, the sources flag things like Florida loosening child labor laws, presenting it as potentially a sign of desperation for economic edge, but with serious social costs.
And look at the sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. The analysis suggests a major miscalculation. The idea was to cripple Russia by cutting off European markets. But it seems they underestimated Russia's ability to pivot, to sell oil and gas to China, to India, the BRICS nations. It diluted the impact significantly.
The whole TikTok situation also seems messy, according to these sources. The shifting stances, the potential for China to use it politically against Trump. It highlights how interconnected and unpredictable things are.
Right. And then you have these other theories floating around, like the prisoner of Putin idea. Highly speculative, of course. But it shows the level of mistrust and uncertainty surrounding some of these decisions.
Something else that stood out was the role of figures like Elon Musk,
Operating kind of outside normal government channels, but with huge influence.
this Department of Government Efficiency idea, his donations, alleged interference in foreign situations, it feels like a shift in how power works.
It does raise questions about influence in the 21st century, absolutely.
Hmm.
To really weigh these potential parallels, though, the sources argue we need that historical context of Germany. You know, Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century, rapid industrial growth, but also a very organized, powerful working class emerging.
And Germany was playing catch-up, in a way, compared to Britain in terms of empire building.
Yes, exactly. They industrialized incredibly fast, became a major power, but it created tensions both inside Germany and with other nations. Then came the absolute catastrophe of World War I, followed by the Versailles Treaty, the hyperinflation in the early 20s that just wiped people out.
It's destroyed savings.
Completely. And then, just as things maybe started to stabilize, the Great Depression hits.
So you have this sequence. War trauma, economic collapse via inflation, then mass unemployment. It created fertile ground for extremism, for polarization. The sources point out even parts of the business world eventually backed Hitler, maybe seeing him as the only way to restore order or fight communism.
And the name itself? National Socialist, trying to appeal to those anti-capitalist feelings, even from the far right.
Precisely. It shows how economic grievance can be manipulated and channeled.
Which leads us to the role of corporations, private wealth. You mentioned Elon Musk earlier, and this was something you, the listener, asked about. The sources use an interesting analogy here, comparing it to feudalism, shifting from local lords to powerful kings. Systems evolve. Right, drawing on Marx's idea that systems kind of try out all their possible variations before they eventually fade or transform. Capitalism has certainly done that. From early private enterprise to the New Deal's government intervention, Scandinavian social democracy, the Soviet model, and now China's steep private hybrid.
And the sources seem to frame China's model as the latest big experiment within capitalism, and a pretty successful one in terms of growth.
In terms of rapid development and lifting people from poverty, yes, undeniably successful. They also contrast this with Europe, suggesting Europe's maybe losing its edge in tech and industry compared to the US and China.
Those high U.S. tariffs on Chinese EVs seems like a defensive move, acknowledging China's lead there.
It certainly looks that way. But the bigger idea floated in these sources is that maybe capitalism itself, having tried all these forms, is hitting some fundamental limits. Marx's point about it always reproducing inequality alongside wealth keeps coming up.
And they touch on how the basic employer-employee setup is rarely questioned fundamentally, suggesting that maybe, looking ahead, more democratic workplaces could be part of a solution, where workers have more say.
That's put forward as a potential future direction, yes.
Yes.
As a way to address some of those persistent power imbalances. Now, shifting gears slightly, you also asked about Mao Zedong and his place in Marxist thinking. The sources really stress his global significance. His key innovation was adapting Marxism, which was focused on industrial workers, to societies that were overwhelmingly rural, peasant-based.
Which was most of the world outside the West at the time.
Exactly. That adaptation made Marxism relevant as a revolutionary force in places like India, Vietnam, and of course China itself. And the argument is that this foundation was crucial for China's development after World War II, leading to where it is today.
And the history of the Chinese Communist Party is quite dramatic. Early urban organizing, the break with Chiang Kai-shek, the Long March.
An incredible story. Establishing that rural base, fighting the Japanese, then winning the Civil War. It's a unique path. And the Taiwan issue, as the sources explain, is a direct legacy of that unfinished civil war.
What about the split between China and the Soviet Union? They were allies initially.
They were, but the split came partly from Mao's different approach, that rural focus, the Great Leap Forward. The communes, it diverged sharply from the Soviet model. Ideology played a role, but so did national interests and strategy. It had a huge impact on communist movements worldwide.
And China deliberately chose its own path then, this state-private mix we see now.
Yes, a conscious decision to build something different from both the Soviet system and Western capitalism. It's interesting, too, the sources mention how Western thinkers, like French Maists, actually engaged with and influenced Chinese thought during certain periods.
Okay, let's turn back to Europe. The sources talk about a perceived decline there.
Yeah, a sense that Europe's global weight isn't what it once was, contrasting its past dominance, industrial, colonial, with its current role. Less central in tech, industry, global power shifts. There's that sort of joke mentioned about England becoming a cold, wet, offshore island. Captures that feeling, maybe harshly.
And the war in Ukraine really highlights Europe's reliance on others, particularly the US, for security.
It seems to underscore that, yes. And reliance on external energy sources, too. The sources even speculate about a future where Europe becomes more of a major tourist destination than a primary economic or political engine. And they link this potential decline back to the idea of moving beyond capitalism, since capitalism really started and matured in Europe.
Using Marx's idea of uneven development again, capitalism finds new, more dynamic centers like the US, now China.
That's the theoretical lens applied. And there's a critique in the sources of some European leaders suggesting they might be in denial about this shift, clinging to past glories.
So, if the American empire potentially declines, and maybe we're moving beyond traditional capitalism, what comes next? That's the big question.
The sources lay out two main possibilities, really. One is that China simply becomes the next global hegemon, the next dominant empire. The other is a move towards something genuinely multinational, without one single power calling the shots.
And the sources seem to favor the second option, learning from why things like the League of Nations or the UN haven't fully achieved that.
There's definitely an argument made for striving towards real multinational cooperation, yes. Acknowledging past failures, but seeing it as a more desirable path than just another cycle of empires.
Finally, the sources brought up the term hegemony and linked it to Antonio Gramsci.
Right, the Italian Marxist thinker. His story is fascinating, involved in labor movements, imprisoned by Mussolini, and it was in prison he wrote his most famous works, the Prison Notebooks. In fact, he used hegemony to talk about how power isn't just about force or economics, it's also about culture, ideology, how consent is manufactured.
So understanding power means looking at things like music, religion, family life, how they shape how we think and accept the status quo.
Exactly. How culture reinforces or challenges power structures. Gramsci was digging deep into that. There's a funny anecdote in the source about how his communist background sometimes gets downplayed in American academic settings. They also mention Louis Althusser, the French thinker, who was heavily influenced by Gramsci.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Potential imperial decline, historical parallels, the evolution of capitalism, key thinkers like Mao and Gramsci, different paths for the future.
It's all deeply interconnected, from the pressures on working classes historically and today, to the rise of new global players, to the very ideas that shape how we understand power.
It definitely feels like understanding these deeper forces is crucial right now for making sense of the present and what might come next.
Absolutely. Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Consider those invisible forces, the cultural, the ideological ones Gramsci talked about. How do they shape your understanding of global power, of our economic system, and thinking beyond empires, beyond maybe even capitalism as we know it? What would genuine multinational cooperation look like? What would democratizing our workplaces actually entail? Lots to think about there.